The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, a warning that sent Nora Jane stumbling backward, her heel catching on the uneven boardwalk. She fell hard in the mud, her carefully mended dress now ruined, laughter erupting from the saloon doorway where 3 men stood watching. The year was 1875, and in this corner of Wyoming territory, a woman alone might as well have been wearing a target. "Look at the high and mighty schoolteacher now," jeered Franklin Rowe, the town's self-appointed bully whose father owned half the businesses on Main Street. "Not so proper with mud on your backside, are you, Miss Jane?" Nora Jane felt the hot sting of tears threatening to spill, but refused to give them the satisfaction. At 24, she'd faced worse than public humiliation, though in this moment it felt like the final straw after weeks of subtle torment since her arrival in town. A shadow fell across her as a tall figure stepped between her and the laughing men. Without a word, he offered a calloused hand. Nora hesitated before accepting it, allowing the stranger to help her to her feet. "They laughed when I fell," she whispered, more to herself than to him, her cheeks burning with shame. The cowboy, face partially obscured by the brim of his hat, fixed his gaze on hers. "Then let them watch you rise," he answered, his voice low and steady. Something in those simple words touched a part of her that had been dormant for too long. The stranger turned to face the men, his hand resting casually near the holster at his hip. The laughter from the saloon doorway died instantly. "I believe you gentlemen owe the lady an apology," he said, calm but resolute, Franklin Rowe's face contorted with anger. "Mind your business, stranger, we don't know you." "Name's Matthew Aldridge," the cowboy replied evenly. "Now you know me." The standoff lasted mere seconds before Franklin and his companions retreated into the saloon, muttering curses. Matthew turned back to Nora, properly tipping his hat. "Are you hurt, miss?" "Jane, Nora Jane," she replied, brushing futilely at her mud-stained skirt. "And no, only my pride is injured, Mr. Aldridge. Please call me Matt." His eyes, she noticed now, were the color of a cloudless Wyoming sky. "May I escort you somewhere safe?" Nora nodded toward the small schoolhouse at the end of the street. "I was heading to prepare tomorrow's lessons." They walked in companionable silence, Nora acutely aware of the curious gazes from townspeople they passed. A stranger escorting the new schoolteacher would fuel the gossip mill for days. "You're new to Redemption Creek," she observed, not a question. Matthew nodded. "Passing through, or was?" Something in his expression shifted. "Maybe I'll stay a while." At the schoolhouse door, Nora found herself reluctant to part ways. "Thank you, Mr. Aldridge, Matt. Your kindness won't be forgotten." "Seems like kindness is in short supply around here," he replied, studying her face with interest. "How long have you been teaching in Redemption Creek?" 3 weeks. The previous teacher left rather suddenly. Nora didn't mention the rumors that surrounded her predecessor's hasty departure. "I came from Boston to take the position," Matt whistled low. "That's quite a journey, family back east." "None to speak of," she answered, the familiar pang of loneliness surfacing briefly. The position came with lodging at Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house. It seemed an opportunity for a fresh start. "Those are worth riding far for," he agreed, something in his tone suggesting he understood better than most. Nora hesitated, then asked, "Will you be staying in town long?" "Haven't decided yet." His gaze swept the dusty Main Street before returning to her. "Though I admit the place is growing more interesting by the minute." The heat that rose to Nora's cheeks had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. She cleared her throat. "Well, if you're in need of reading material during your stay, the schoolhouse has a modest library. You'd be welcome to borrow a book." His smile transformed his weather-worn face. "I might just take you up on that, Miss Jane." As he turned to leave, Nora called after him, "The men who laughed Franklin Rowe and his friends, they run this town. Be careful." Matthew looked back, the hint of a smile playing at his lips. "I appreciate the warning, but I've crossed paths with men like Rowe before. Usually they're all hat and no cattle." With a tip of his hat, he walked away, leaving Nora standing in the schoolhouse doorway wondering what twist of fate had brought Matthew Aldridge to Redemption Creek on this particular day. The following morning, Nora arrived at the schoolhouse early, as was her habit. The incident from the previous day had left her determined to maintain her dignity despite Franklin Rowe's attempts to undermine her position in the community. She had just finished writing the day's arithmetic lesson on the blackboard when a knock at the door startled her. Matthew Aldridge stood on the threshold, hat in hand, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the academic setting. "Good morning, Mr. Aldridge," Nora said, unable to hide her surprise. "Miss Jane," he nodded politely. "I thought I might take you up on that offer to borrow a book." "If it's not too much trouble." Nora gestured him inside, conscious of her quickened pulse. "Of course, though I should warn you, our selection is limited, mostly primers and a few classics." Matthew ran a finger along the spines of the few volumes arranged on the shelf behind her desk. "Anything you'd recommend?" "That depends on your taste," she replied, watching him curiously. "Do you prefer adventure or philosophy, history or poetry?" A smile tugged at his lips. "I've had enough adventure lately to last a while, perhaps something with ideas worth pondering." Nora selected a worn copy of Emerson's essays. "This might suit you, then." Their fingers brushed as she handed him the book, and Nora pulled away quickly, flustered by her reaction to such a simple touch. "Thank you." Matthew tucked the book under his arm. "I've taken a room at the boarding house on Pine Street. Mrs. Whittaker mentioned you're staying there as well." "Yes," Nora confirmed, wondering what else the talkative landlady had shared about her. "It's the only respectable lodging for a single woman in Redemption Creek." "And how long do you plan to stay in town, Miss Jane?" Matthew asked, studying her with those penetrating blue eyes. Nora straightened her shoulders. "I signed a contract for the school year. Despite yesterday's unpleasantness, I intend to honor that commitment." "Admirable," he said, his expression softening. "Though Franklin Rowe and his kind don't strike me as men who give up easily. They're bullies, Mr. Aldridge, and I've faced bullies before." Determination colored her voice. "I came west to build something for myself, not to run at the first sign of trouble." Matthew nodded, a new respect evident in his gaze. "Well then, perhaps Redemption Creek has finally found the schoolteacher it needs." The sound of children's voices approaching signaled the impending start of the school day. Matthew moved toward the door, pausing before he left. "I wonder, Miss Jane, if you might consider joining me for supper at the hotel restaurant this evening. I'd like to hear more about your journey west." Nora hesitated, aware of the impropriety of dining alone with a man she barely knew, yet unwilling to refuse. "That would be acceptable, though we will undoubtedly be the subject of tomorrow's gossip." "Let them talk," Matthew replied with a smile that reached his eyes. "I find I don't much care what Franklin Rowe and his friends think." As he departed, Nora wondered what she'd just agreed to. In Boston, her reputation had been her armor. Here in Redemption Creek, that armor was already dented by association with the mysterious cowboy who'd come to her rescue. The school day passed in a blur of arithmetic problems and history lessons. Nora found her thoughts repeatedly drifting to the evening ahead, to the man who'd stood up for her when no one else would. By the time the children departed for the day, her stomach was tied in knots of anticipation. At precisely 7 o'clock, Matthew waited outside Mrs. Whittaker's boarding house. He'd exchanged his trail-worn clothes for a clean shirt and vest, his dark hair still damp from what must have been a recent bath. "You look lovely," he said simply as Nora descended the porch steps in her best blue dress, the only one she owned without a patch or mend. "Thank you." She accepted his offered arm, acutely aware of Mrs. Whittaker watching from behind the parlor curtains. "I should warn you, the hotel restaurant serves the worst beef stew west of the Mississippi." Matthew laughed, the sound warming her more than it should have. "I'll risk it for the company." The few blocks to the Redemption Creek Hotel felt like a public procession, with townspeople pausing in their evening activities to observe the schoolteacher and the stranger. By the time they reached the hotel's modest dining room, Nora's cheeks were flushed with self-consciousness. "Everyone's staring," she murmured as Matthew held her chair. "Let them," he replied easily, taking his seat across from her. "In my experience, small towns run on gossip like engines run on coal. Give it a week and they'll find someone else to talk about." Over surprisingly palatable stew, Matthew shared carefully edited tales of his years working cattle drives from Texas to Montana. Nora found herself laughing more than she had in months, drawn to his dry wit and thoughtful observations. "What brought you to Wyoming?" she asked as they lingered over coffee. A shadow crossed his face. "I'm tracking someone, a man who did something unforgivable." The stark admission surprised her. "You're not just a cowboy passing through, are you?" "I was once." Matthew's voice dropped, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. "Now I work for the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The man I'm tracking, James Blackwell, robbed a bank in Cheyenne. 3 people died, including a child." Nora's hand flew to her mouth. "And you believe he's here, in Redemption Creek?" "I have reason to think he passed through recently." "My job is to find him and bring him to justice." Matthew studied her reaction carefully. "Does that change your opinion of me, Miss Jane?" "No," she said without hesitation. "Justice is necessary, especially when innocent lives are lost." She paused, considering. "But why tell me this?" "Because I value honesty," he replied, his blue eyes intent on hers. "And because I find myself wanting you to know the real me, not just the convenient story I tell others." The admission hung between them, weighted with possibility. Nora felt the stirrings of something dangerous, trust, perhaps, or something deeper that she dared not name. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Franklin Rowe and 2 companions, their loud entrance drawing attention from every corner of the dining room. "Well, if it isn't the schoolmarm and her knight in dusty leather," Franklin drawled, stopping beside their table. The whiskey on his breath suggested he'd already spent considerable time at the saloon. Matthew's posture shifted subtly, relaxed yet ready. "Evening, Rowe." "I'd say it's a pleasure, but my mother taught me not to lie." Franklin's face reddened with anger. "You're making a mistake, stranger. This town isn't big enough for troublemakers." "Funny, I was thinking the same thing," Matthew replied evenly. "Yet here you are." One of Franklin's companions, Nora, recognized him as Seth Mason. The banker's son put a restraining hand on Franklin's arm. "Let's go, Frank. Not worth making a scene." Franklin shrugged off the hand but seemed to reconsider. "This isn't over, Aldridge." "And you, Miss Jane," his gaze shifted to Nora, cold with malice. "School board might be interested to know their teacher keeps company with drifters of questionable character." "The school board hired me for my ability to educate children, Mr. Rowe, not for my choice in dinner companions," Nora replied firmly, surprising herself with her boldness. Franklin's eyes narrowed, but he allowed his friends to lead him away to a table across the room. For the remainder of the meal, Nora could feel his hostile gaze on them. "I'm afraid I've made your position here more difficult," Matthew said as he escorted her back to the boarding house later that evening. Nora shook her head. "Franklin Rowe had marked me as a target from my first day in town. Your presence has simply given him a new angle of attack." They paused at the bottom of the boarding house steps, the night air cool around them, stars brilliant in the vast Wyoming sky. "Why does he dislike you so much?" Matthew asked. Nora smiled wryly. "I rejected his advances my second week here, politely but firmly. Men like Franklin Rowe aren't accustomed to hearing no." "Ah," understanding crossed Matthew's face. "A wounded ego can be more dangerous than a wounded bear, indeed." Nora gazed up at him, reluctant for the evening to end. "When will you continue your search for this James Blackwell?" "I've already begun making inquiries, discreetly." Matthew hesitated, then reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "But I find myself in no hurry to leave Redemption Creek." The warmth of his fingers around hers sent a pleasant shiver through Nora. "I'm glad," she admitted softly. In the week that followed, Matthew became a frequent visitor to the schoolhouse, arriving after the children had departed to return one borrowed book and select another. Their conversations ranged from literature to philosophy, from the challenges of teaching to Matthew's adventures across the Western Territories. Each evening, they would walk together through town, sometimes stopping for supper at the hotel, other times sharing simpler meals prepared by Mrs. Whittaker, who had taken an immediate liking to the well-mannered detective. Nora knew the town was watching, judging, but found she cared less with each passing day. Matthew's presence gave her a confidence she'd never experienced before, a sense that she was not alone in facing whatever Redemption Creek might throw at her. On Saturday, Matthew suggested a ride into the surrounding countryside. "There's a spot about 5 miles east of town, a hidden valley with a creek running through it. Perfect for a picnic lunch." Nora hesitated, aware of the impropriety of such an excursion, yet unwilling to refuse. Mrs. Whittaker would need to accompany us as chaperone. Matthew agreed readily, and by mid-morning the three of them were riding out of town, a picnic basket secured to Mrs. Whittaker's saddle. The older woman, a widow who had come west with her husband before the war, was clearly delighted by the adventure. "It's been years since I've ridden farther than the general store," she confided to Nora as they followed Matthew along a narrow trail. "Mr. Aldridge is a fine gentleman to think of it." The valley, when they reached it, proved even more beautiful than Matthew had described. Cottonwood trees lined the creek banks, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. Wildflowers dotted the grassy meadow, and in the distance, the mountains rose majestically against the clear blue sky. While Mrs. Whittaker dozed under a tree after lunch, Matthew led Nora along the creek. Their conversation, usually so easy, gave way to a comfortable silence as they absorbed the natural beauty surrounding them. "I never thought I'd find such peace out here," Nora admitted finally. "In Boston, everything was structured, predictable. I came west expecting hardship and challenge, but not this." She gestured to the landscape around them. "The West changes people," Matthew replied, his eyes on the distant mountains. "Some it breaks, others it rebuilds. I've seen both. And you, how has it changed you?" Matthew considered the question before answering. "It showed me who I truly am beneath the expectations of others. Out here, a man is judged by his actions, not his name or his family's standing." "Is that why you became a detective?" Nora asked, genuinely curious about the path that had led him to this moment, walking beside her in a hidden Wyoming valley. "Partly." Matthew's expression grew serious. "I witnessed an injustice, once a guilty man walking free because he had money and connections. I couldn't prevent it, but I promised myself I'd spend my life ensuring others like him faced consequences for their actions." Nora studied his profile, seeing the determination that drove him. "That's admirable." "Not always," he admitted. "Sometimes the pursuit becomes consuming. Before I met you, I'd forgotten there was more to life than tracking the next criminal." The admission hung between them, charged with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Matthew reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, and for a moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. Their peaceful interlude was shattered by the distant sound of approaching horses. Matthew tensed immediately, his free hand moving to the gun at his hip. "Stay here," he instructed, leading Nora back toward where Mrs. Whittaker was now stirring from her nap. "Could be nothing, but I don't like unexpected company this far from town." 3 riders appeared at the edge of the valley, Franklin Row, and 2 men Nora recognized as regular companions in his misdeeds. "Well, look what we found, boys," Franklin called as they rode closer. "The schoolmarm having herself an improper outing." Matthew positioned himself protectively in front of Nora and Mrs. Whittaker. "Nothing improper about a chaperoned picnic, Roe. Now state your business or ride on." Franklin's gaze shifted from Matthew to Nora, his expression ugly with spite. "My business, Aldridge, is protecting this town from undesirables. Been doing some asking around about you. Seems nobody knows much, which makes a man wonder what you're hiding." "I'm not hiding anything," Matthew replied evenly. Unlike some, I don't need to boast about my business to feel important. Franklin dismounted, hand resting on the pistol holstered at his hip. See, that's where you're wrong. I know exactly who you are, Aldridge. Or should I say Pinkerton? Nora felt Matthew stiffen beside her. How you spend your days is your concern, he said carefully. Now, we were just finishing our picnic, not so fast. Franklin took a step forward, his companions remaining mounted but watchful. I also know who you're hunting. James Blackwell, the Cheyenne bank robber, Mrs. Whitaker gasped softly. Nora placed a steadying hand on the older woman's arm, her eyes never leaving the confrontation unfolding before them. That information isn't public knowledge, Matthew said, his voice dangerously quiet. How did you come by it? A triumphant smile spread across Franklin's face. Let's just say I have connections in Cheyenne. Telegraph wires work both ways, detective. Understanding dawned on Matthew's face. You know where Blackwell is? Maybe I do, maybe I don't. Franklin shrugged, clearly enjoying having the upper hand. But I know he pays well for information about Pinkertons on his trail. You've been warning him, Matthew said, disgust evident in his tone. 3 people died in that robbery row, including an 8-year-old girl. Something flickered in Franklin's eyes, a momentary hesitation, perhaps before the mask of arrogance returned. Not my concern. Blackwell's money spends just as well as anyone else's. You disgust me, Nora said suddenly, unable to contain her revulsion. To profit from such tragedy, there's no lower act. Franklin's attention shifted to her, his expression hardening. Strong words from a woman with secrets of her own, Miss Jane, or should I say Eleanor Nightingale. The use of her birth name, a name she'd abandoned years ago, sent ice through Nora's veins. How do you, the same connections that told me about Aldridge here, Franklin said smugly. Seems Boston's finest families still remember the scandal. The headmaster's daughter running off with the groundskeeper's son, only to be abandoned when he found greener pastures. That's enough, Matthew warned, taking a step toward Franklin. The school board might be interested to know they hired damaged goods, Franklin continued, his eyes never leaving Nora's pale face. A woman whose own family disowned her, hardly a proper example for impressionable children. I said that's enough. Matthew's hand moved to his gun, but Franklin was quicker, drawing his weapon and aiming it squarely at Matthew's chest. I wouldn't Pinkerton. My friends here are excellent shots, and there's only one of you. Nora watched in horror as the confrontation escalated, fear for Matthew overwhelming her shame at having her past exposed. What do you want, Ro? Matthew asked, hands carefully raised to show he wasn't reaching for his weapon. I want you gone from Redemption Creek by sundown, Franklin replied coldly. And I want your word you'll stop pursuing Blackwell. I can't do that. Then perhaps this will persuade you. Franklin shifted his aim to Nora. How much is your job worth to you, detective, worth this woman's life? Mrs. Whitaker cried out in fear, but Nora stood perfectly still, refusing to show the terror that coursed through her. You won't shoot an unarmed woman in cold blood, Matthew said, his voice steady despite the tension evident in every line of his body. Even you're not that far gone, Ro. Maybe not, Franklin conceded. But I could ensure she never teaches again. One word to the school board about her sordid past and she'll be on the next stage out of town. Do it, Nora said suddenly, stepping forward despite Matthew's warning glance. Tell them everything, Mr. Rowe. Tell them I fell in love unwisely as a girl of 18. Tell them I was abandoned and disowned. Tell them I came west to start anew. She moved closer, ignoring Franklin's pistol still pointed in her direction. Then let them decide if that makes me unfit to teach their children reading and arithmetic and history. Because from where I stand, a woman who has known hardship and persevered might be exactly the kind of teacher this town needs. Franklin faltered, clearly unprepared for her defiance. You're bluffing. No respectable town would keep you on after learning the truth. Perhaps, Nora acknowledged, but I won't be driven away by threats from a man who profits from the death of a child." A tense silence fell over the valley. Franklin's companions exchanged uncertain glances, their enthusiasm for the confrontation visibly waning. "You're making a mistake," Franklin said finally, lowering his weapon slightly. "Both of you." "The only mistake," Matthew replied, "was thinking you had honor enough to be ashamed of your actions." With a final glare, Franklin holstered his pistol and remounted his horse. "This isn't over, Aldridge, for either of you." As the three riders disappeared back the way they had come, Nora felt her knees weaken, the adrenaline that had sustained her courage ebbing away. Matthew was at her side instantly, supporting her with a gentle arm around her waist. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever witnessed," he murmured, his voice a mixture of admiration and concern. "Likely both," Nora admitted, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I suppose now you know my shameful secret as well." Matthew's expression softened. "There's no shame in having loved, Nora, only in never having tried." Mrs. Whittaker joined them, her face pale but resolute. "We should return to town, dears. If that dreadful man intends to spread tales about Miss Jane, better we face it directly than hide out here." The ride back to Redemption Creek was somber, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the town limits, Matthew broke the silence. "I won't leave you to face this alone," he promised Nora. "Whatever Roe says or does, we'll confront it together." Nora studied his determined profile, wondering at the twist of fate that had brought this man into her life just when she needed him most. "Thank you, but your duty is to capture Blackwell, not to protect my reputation." "Maybe I've found a duty that matters more," Matthew replied quietly. By the time they reached the boarding house, word of Franklin's accusations had already spread through town. A small crowd had gathered outside, curious faces turning to watch as Matthew helped Nora and Mrs. Whittaker dismount. Among them stood Reverend Collins and Mayor Wilson, both members of the school board. Their expressions were grave as they approached. "Miss Jane," the Reverend began, "we've heard some concerning allegations about your past." Nora straightened her shoulders, prepared to defend herself, when a commanding voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "Before you listen to Franklin Roe's poison, Mrs. Whittaker announced loudly, positioning herself protectively beside Nora, "you should know he's been taking money from a wanted murderer, a man who killed a child in Cheyenne." Shocked whispers rippled through the gathered townspeople. Mayor Wilson frowned deeply. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Whittaker?" "It's the truth," Matthew confirmed, stepping forward. "I'm Matthew Aldridge, agent with the Pinkerton Detective Agency. I've been tracking James Blackwell, wanted for a bank robbery in Cheyenne that left 3 people dead. Franklin Roe has been warning him of my presence in exchange for payment." The Reverend's expression shifted from concern to disgust. "If this is true—" "It is," Nora interjected. "Mr. Roe admitted as much today before threatening us to keep silent. As for Miss Jane's past, Mrs. Whittaker continued, her voice carrying to every ear. "She fell in love with an unworthy young man in her youth and was cast out by her family for it. She came west to build a respectable life through honest work. I ask you all, is there anyone among us who hasn't made mistakes in their youth? Anyone who hasn't sought a fresh start?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Several nodded in reluctant agreement. "I've watched Miss Jane with the children these past weeks," Mrs. Whittaker pressed on. "She's dedicated, patient, and kind. Are we to punish her for having a heart, while men like Franklin Roe profit from violence and death?" A murmur of support began to build. Reverend Collins cleared his throat. "The school board will need to discuss this matter, of course, but speaking personally, I see no reason Miss Jane shouldn't continue her duties while we do so." Relief washed over Nora, unexpected tears pricking at her eyes. "Thank you, Reverend." As the crowd dispersed, Matthew touched her arm gently. "This isn't over. Roe knows I'm after Blackwell and he'll warn him. I need to act quickly." "What will you do?" Nora asked, suddenly fearful that he would leave immediately. First, send a telegram to my superiors. Then pay a visit to the sheriff. Matthew's expression was grim. Franklin Rowe has been aiding a fugitive. That makes him an accessory. Be careful, Nora urged. He's dangerous, especially now that he's been exposed. Matthew's hand found hers, squeezing gently. I didn't come this far to be stopped by a man like Rowe. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of activity. Sheriff Taylor, initially skeptical of Matthew's claims, became convinced after a telegram from the Cheyenne marshal confirmed the details of Blackwell's crimes and Matthew's identity as a Pinkerton agent. Franklin Rowe was arrested that evening, his protests silenced when a search of his rooms revealed correspondence with Blackwell and a substantial amount of money that he couldn't explain. His companions, faced with similar charges, quickly turned on him, revealing that Blackwell was hiding at an abandoned mining camp in the hills 20 miles north of town. By dawn, Matthew had organized a posse of dependable men preparing to ride out and capture the bank robber. He found Nora waiting on the porch of the boarding house as he made his final preparations. I had to see you before you left, she explained, her hands twisting nervously in her skirts, to wish you safe return. Matthew stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. I'll come back, Nora. I promise you that. You can't know for certain, she whispered, fear for him evident in her face. Blackwell has killed before. True, Matthew acknowledged, but I have something to come back for now. He reached out, gently cupping her cheek, something I never had before. Nora leaned into his touch, her heart racing. Matthew. He kissed her then, a tender promise that spoke more eloquently than words. When they parted, both were breathless, forever changed by the moment. I love you, Nora Jane, Matthew said simply. I think I have since that first day when you refused to stay down after they laughed at you. Tears filled her eyes. I love you too, please come back to me. Wild horses couldn't keep me away, he promised, reluctantly stepping back as the posse assembled in the street. With a final nod, he mounted his horse and rode out, leading the men toward the distant hills. The day passed with excruciating slowness for Nora. She went through the motions of teaching, but her mind remained fixed on Matthew and the dangers he faced. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, she found herself standing on the schoolhouse steps, straining to see any sign of the returning posse. It was nearly dusk when they finally appeared, riding slowly into town. Nora's heart stopped at the sight of a body draped across one of the horses, then started again when she recognized Matthew riding at the head of the group, dusty but unharmed. She ran toward him, propriety forgotten in her relief. Matthew dismounted quickly, meeting her halfway. Without a word, he swept her into his arms, holding her as though he would never let go. Blackwell, she asked when she could finally speak. Dead, Matthew replied grimly. He chose to fight rather than surrender. No one else was hurt. And your job, will you need to return to Cheyenne? Matthew smiled, his arms still around her waist. I've already sent my resignation to the agency. I'm thinking of putting down roots. Redemption Creek seems like a fine place to start. Joy bloomed in Nora's heart. It is now, she agreed, uncaring of the townspeople watching their reunion with varying degrees of approval and amusement. 2 months later, Nora stood before Reverend Collins in the town's small church, Matthew beside her as they exchanged vows. The pews were filled with students and their families, all tensions forgotten in the celebration of new beginnings. They laughed when I fell, Nora whispered to Matthew as they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife. He squeezed her hand, love shining in his eyes. And they watched you rise. We rose together. Outside, the citizens of Redemption Creek showered them with rice and well wishes. Among them stood Mayor Wilson, who had recently appointed Matthew as deputy sheriff following the recognition of his role in bringing Blackwell to justice and exposing Franklin Rowe's corruption. As the newlyweds prepared to depart for the small house they'd purchased on the edge of town, Reverend Collins called for attention. The school board has an announcement, he said, smiling at Nora. In recognition of Mrs. Aldridge's exceptional dedication to our children's education, we've unanimously voted to extend her contract for 5 years, with an increase in salary to fund additional books and supplies for the schoolhouse. Cheers erupted from the gathered children, none louder than from young Tommy Wilson, the mayor's son, who had struggled with reading until Nora's patient guidance had unlocked the mystery of letters for him. That evening, as they stood on the porch of their new home, Matthew pulled Nora close beneath the vast star-filled Wyoming sky. "Happy?" he asked, his breath warm against her hair. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "From the moment you helped me rise from the mud that day, I've been falling in love with you." "Then I'll spend the rest of our lives making sure you never fall alone again," Matthew promised, sealing his words with a kiss as the sun set on Redemption Creek, painting the future in shades of gold and promise. In the years that followed, Nora and Matthew built a life rich with purpose and love. The schoolhouse expanded under Nora's guidance, eventually requiring a second teacher as Redemption Creek grew from a rough frontier town into a thriving community. Matthew served as sheriff after his predecessor retired, bringing a steady justice that earned him respect throughout the territory. They welcomed 2 children of their own, a daughter with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determination, and a son whose gentle spirit reminded them both of the importance of kindness in a sometimes harsh world. And on quiet evenings, they would often sit together on their porch, watching the sun set over the distant mountains, grateful for that fateful day when a cowboy had offered his hand to a fallen schoolteacher, changing both their lives forever.